Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Today, we are discussing how to prepare for pay data enforcement presented by Mark Dwyer and Craig Lean. My name is Angel Fisher. I'm the Product Marketing Manager at Circa, and I will be moderating today's webinar. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. First, a very quick webinar 101. You'll notice a GoToWebinar panel on your screen. To minimize this panel, simply click on the orange rectangle. The content we are covering today is about an hour or so. Feel free to please put in any questions that you have into the question box, and we will answer as many generalized questions as possible during the live Q&A at the end of our presentation. You will be muted the whole time, so I do invite you to please put your questions into the question box. Additionally, we are recording this presentation, and we will provide the on-demand version in an email follow-up later this week. For those listening via the internet, please keep in mind that hardwired connections are recommended instead of wireless connections to ensure the best sound quality. To give you a little bit of information about who we are at Circa, Circa is a catalyst for companies to build high-performing, diverse teams based on research that shows companies want to shift from diversity as a program to diversity as a business strategy. Circa was founded in 1994. We have over 4,000 federal contractor customers, over 15,000 community partner relationships, and a network of over 600 online employment websites. We have HRCI and SHRM accredited webinars like the one that you're attending today, each month on compliance and diversity related topics. We also have a weekly Ofccp digest publication that comes out every Thursday. Our Ask the Experts forum with industry leaders is a great feature on our website that provides relevant information for your business and Ofccp needs. We're proud members of the ILG and AAED and sponsor and speak at several Ofccp related conferences nationally each year. Please keep in mind that our presentation gives generalized information and is not intended in any way as legal advice. You should always consult with a lawyer about your particular situation, as this information may not be applicable to you. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers. Mark Dwyer is Vice President of Data Science for Trusaic. He is responsible for evolving Trusaic's analytics regarding pay, diversity, and data consolidation processes as the company continues to scale and expand its robust data and analytics solutions. Mark has 16 years of experience in statistical analysis with class action litigation and has offered oral and written testimony regarding statistical modeling. He earned a PhD in economics from the University of Rochester, an MA in finance from the Wharton School, and a BA in physics from the University of Pennsylvania. Craig Lean is on the Circa board and a member of the K&L Gates Labor, Employment, and Workplace Safety Practice Group. Prior to joining the firm, Craig served as Director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at the U.S. Department of Labor. There he served as the leader and senior executive of a premier civil rights enforcement agency that achieved records for both enforcement, recoveries, and compliance assistance in 2019 and 2020. Craig reported directly to the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Labor, overseeing approximately 450 employees and a budget of over $105 million, with a mission to ensure compliance by federal contractors with equal employment opportunity and non-discrimination obligations. From his leadership experience at Osccp and the U.S. Department of Labor, Craig provides clients who conduct business with the federal government a wealth of information and insight into the enforcement of equal employment opportunity regulations and compliance with affirmative action and non-discrimination obligations. In addition, he advises clients on developing pay equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And now I'll turn it over to Mark to take us through today's outline and agenda.
Thank you, Angel. Yes, so let me just start with hitting the sort of roadmap here. So we'll begin with just a review of what pay gaps are, particularly focusing on gender and race pay gaps to start. And then we'll see, those are sort of the motivation that we'll examine just briefly. And then we'll move into sort of the state and federal responses to the observation over many decades of these persistent pay gaps. So we'll review that legislative and regulatory response. And then the third element will be sort of and fourth elements will be to take a little bit more of a detailed look at a couple of those responses, one being in California, the other one a recent legislation that was just passed this year in Illinois. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some direction and advice, but not legal advice, but recommendations in terms of how employers can best position themselves for facing these increasing legislative and regulatory actions that are attempting to address these pay issues. I mean, just before we get started on this, I wanted to start with a quote from Robert Sheen, the CEO of Trusaic, who observes it's a human right to achieve pay equity. And there, I just wanted to note that what he's referring to is the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in Article 23 does in fact state that everyone without discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work.
And if I could add something here, you know, for Ofccp, where I was the director for a couple years, and where I know the current director, Director Yang, and even going back to Director Shu and Director James, pay equity is going to be the major issue for Ofccp for the foreseeable future. There's still very large pay gaps in this country. So I'm really excited to have this discussion today, because there's a lot of, and with you, Mark, in particular, since you're so knowledgeable on the topic. But to me, this is really where it's at right now in the Ofccp EEOC world, because of the administration statement of how much they're going to focus on pay equity. And frankly, at this point, it's bipartisan, you know, because that was also my focus when I was Ofccp director. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Craig. Me too. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the gender pay gap? So we're just starting here with perhaps what might be the most familiar form of pay gap, which is the gender pay gap, or the gender wage pay gap. And here we have a couple of trends that are illustrating both the persistence of the pay gap for women versus men over time, over several decades here, now looking at 4 decades of data, but also to illustrate the idea between a uncontrolled versus a controlled measure of pay gap. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at all workers, all female workers versus male workers, and we're also presenting a pretty recognizable scale, which is saying what's the percentage of women's earnings versus men's earnings as a percentage or as cents on the dollar. So you can interpret that scale there as saying women earned 64 cents on the dollar back in 1980, and then that's risen up to say 85 cents on the male dollar by 2018, which is the latest data available here. The reason that this might be considered an unadjusted pay gap or not controlling for any factors is that it's looking at all workers over the age of 16. There are many controls that could be used to make a more apples to apples comparison. And on the right-hand side, we see a step in that direction, which is just looking at controlling for age differences. So if age and experience play a role in compensation, and if there were differences in the age distribution of men and women in the economy, then that could skew results. And so on the right-hand side, what we're looking at is the same type of comparison, but focusing only on workers between 25 and 34. So the first thing that we observe is that if we look at the 2 endpoints, they're both higher. So there is some improvement. That means that some of the pay gap, we moved from 64 cents on the dollar in 1980 up to 67 cents on the dollar. And we moved from 85 cents on the dollar in 2018 up to 89 cents on the dollar. So we're closing that gap by controlling for these age differences. But there's still a sizable gap left, and there are many other factors that could be controlled for. Another interesting two interesting features that come out of this comparison here is that just controlling for this common age cohort here, we see that actually the pay gap over time gets more variable, which is kind of unusual. Usually you'd expect that the pay gap would be more stable once you take out other sources of variation like age differences. The second thing that we see is that between about 2012 and 2018, the pay gap for this age cohort of women has actually been getting worse. That it's been getting further away from a dollar for dollar rather than narrowing.
And so here's the issue. The fact that there is a pay gap continues to be concerning to the regulators, concerning to companies. I can't tell you how many companies I've worked with at K&L Gates through Circa, which have indicated how much they care about eliminating the pay gap. At the same time, based on what Mark just said, it hasn't been getting better recently. It got a lot better early in the 80s and 90s, and a big part of that was because women were going into jobs that had been before, based on discrimination and stereotypes, traditionally considered to be men's jobs. And these jobs often paid more money. And that's why, I have a daughter, many of us have daughters, told my daughter, you can do anything. And in fact, that was a mantra of the 80s and 90s, that girls could do anything boys could do, women could do anything men could do. And I think that we have largely achieved that, at least in terms of what is said by government, businesses. But what's troubling, and why the regulators keep looking at this, is that stat that Mark just mentioned. Over the last 10 years, you're actually seeing a little bit of backtracking on the pay gap. And remember, this is more of an average, as he mentioned. This is not pay disparities, and that's actually, in the end, what companies are concerned about, because the law doesn't prohibit pay gaps, it prohibits pay disparities based on gender. And so that's why the pay disparities are extraordinarily important. But when you're looking at this, I can tell you, as the former director of Ofccp, I would guess that the current director of Ofccp or the current chair of the EOC looking at this will be concerned and will continue to want to focus on pay equity. That's why I've been saying, and continue to say, it's going to be the biggest issue for the next decade until these numbers start to go the other way.
Great points, Craig. Thank you. Angel, can we have the next slide, please?
We have it.
There we go. So this is again looking at the gender pay gap that we were just looking at in terms of controlling for a common age group on the right-hand side previously. Here, this is using a different control. This is controlling for education level. So one of the things that you see here, we have men in blue and women in gray in terms of average earnings, is that as we go down the column, the rows here from the top of the chart to the bottom, we're getting higher levels of education. And with higher levels of education, we see that both sets of bars are increasing. So as we would expect, employees with higher levels of education have more skills, and they're getting higher levels of compensation as a consequence. So that's not too surprising. What is surprising, though, is that the gap between men and women is also growing as education increases. So at the first level here, which is with less than a high school education, we have about a 20% gap at just about 80%, 80 cents on the dollar. But then as we get up into it to the most educated individuals, that gap has increased. Okay, so now we're almost at a 26% gap between men and women. So while we expect that these controls will help us to explain some of the pay gap, this is an example where adding additional controls, looking again at these cohorts in greater detail, we're seeing in some cases a widening of the pay gap.
Yes, and I would, this is a really important slide because it explains to some extent, to a large extent, why Ofccp and the EOC have been focusing more on executive level positions. One, because the gap is larger for executive level positions, both in real terms and in a percentage, as you can see. So also, I will tell you just from a factual matter, federal agencies like to get big recoveries, and they're more likely to get a bigger recovery when they're focusing on executive level positions because of the higher pay. Now, that has led to a movement within Ofccp and the EOC, and I could speak more to Ofccp, to focusing on, to moving from what were traditionally called blue collar jobs to more what were traditionally called white collar jobs, executive level jobs. This has caused some internal debate because there's a pay gap among all jobs, as you can see, basically, and all education levels. And there's an argument that for those that are in jobs that don't make as much money, the pay gap is even more harmful to them because every dollar, the marginal benefit of every dollar there is more because you have less money. And so, that's something to think about. But I think that and I have to tell you, I agreed at the agency with focusing more on executive level positions. And the reason was that the pay gap was just so large. And it was hard to explain why there would be such a large pay gap in those jobs. And that's why when I was Ofccp director, I would ask companies, and I do this now when I advise companies, don't only look at compensation, but look at promotions as well. Because often it's the promotion to a higher position at a finance company, at a law firm, accounting firm, that could be the partner position. At other companies, it could be an executive leadership role or management position. But advancing a woman to that higher position will lead over time to much more compensation and will help limit that pay gap. So that's why I would ask companies, I wouldn't say, between a particular man and a particular woman, you have to advance based on merit. But if what you're finding is 8 out of 10 times you're advancing the man over the woman, well, even though that you may not view that as a compensation discrimination issue, it really is because of all the compensation that comes with the advancement.
Great point, Craig. Yeah, just to circle, close the loop on that. What you might find in terms of pay disparity is that the pay gap is explained by those positional differences. And what Craig is noting is that when you shift from when you're able to explain pay gap, when there's a factor that is systematically different between men and women, and it helps to explain that pay gap, it raises the issue, at least, to examine whether there's a disparate impact effect there.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Mark. And I have to tell you, the agency is focusing more and more on what it calls steering, which many of you are probably aware of, or failure to promote, and looking at that as a part of compensation. Anyway, I just brought it up. I know we're talking more about compensation here, but that partially explains why there may be a gap in college and advanced degree in terms of pay.
Yep.
Next
Great.
slide. Next slide.
Great. So here, instead of looking at controlling for different factors in the gender wage gap, we're going to bring in now another dimension of pay differences, which is the racial pay gap. And so you can see here that this data, which is from 2019, shows this is using white. This is focusing just on men, and it's looking at white men as the base. So they're the reference dollar. So what this is then showing is that for different race ethnicities, we see substantial pay gaps just among men, and similarly among women. But so, for instance, we see 87 cents on the dollar for black males versus white males, 91 cents on the dollar on the white male dollar for Native American men, and so on. At the bottom of the chart here, you see that in these data, which were collected by PayScale, Asian men are actually earning on average more than white men, coming in at $1.15. Now, we'll get to the federal and state legislation in a bit, but that legislation it's important to remind ourselves is colorblind, right? And so it's looking to see that there are no wage disparities in any direction, so against any group. So if we were to think about what are the pay gaps here, the actual pay gaps being measured here are bigger than the ones that are shown here, because these are being measured relative to white men, but white men are not the highest paid race ethnicity here. It's Asian men, and so from that perspective, the pay gaps here for white males are 87 cents on the dollar, and for black males it's 76 cents on the dollar. So again, these are not controlled for anything, but it's a an example that there is a question, there's an issue here, and it's been a persistent issue for a long time as well, about race and ethnicity differences in pay.
Yes, and I'll tell you, at OFCCP, more and more often, the comparator group now are Asian men. And that's why these pay gaps, as Mark mentioned, are really larger. You might think that the pay gap between whites and Hispanics at 9%, although troubling, is not as large as some of the other pay gaps we talked about. But when you compare the pay gap between Asians and Hispanics, now you're looking at more like almost a 15% pay gap, or perhaps even more. And that begins to look like the pay gap for women. So that's why racial pay gaps continue to be present. And one thing I think we're going to talk about a little later is intersectional pay gaps. Although I just want to mention it here briefly, the largest pay gap that really is measured is for Hispanic women compared to white males, or actually Asian males, which it'd be even larger. They typically compare it to white males. They typically compare Hispanic women to white males, but comparing to Asian men, even larger pay gap. But these pay gaps are almost 50%. And that's why it's important that companies are looking at intersectional pay gaps as well. Next slide.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark, do you have a thought on?
Yeah, just on that intersectionality, I have
there it is. I knew it was coming.
It's a very next slide, and here we are. So, and this slide brings together data from many different sources, but it is, as Craig mentioned, it is important to think about this intersectional issue and how it exacerbates and compounds pay differences. So, for example, just looking at some of the statistics here, the annual loss, median loss for Black women is over $24,000, and as Craig observed, for Latinas, it's also even worse. Okay, at $29,000 and over $24,000 for Native American women. So this again, these are individuals who are hit both by the gender pay gap and by differences in race, ethnicity in terms of pay, and that has this compounding effect. So this bottom chart is hitting those numbers that some of those numbers that Craig was finding as well, where Latinas are earning 55 cents on the dollar. Okay, for every dollar a white male earns. Black women 63 cents on the dollar, and so on. So these are really tremendous differences in pay. Now these numbers here are what we would call unadjusted, right? We're not adjusting, we're not controlling for commonalities or differences like we were before, like education level or age group. But on the right-hand side, we're looking at controlling for occupation, okay, at a pretty narrow level. Okay, so for instance, health care and social workers or child care workers. And we're looking at Black women in particular versus white men and their pay rates, their average pay rates, median pay rates. So you can see here in the two of those columns where we have median hourly wage for Black women in the occupation and median hourly wage for white non-Hispanic men in the occupation, down the line, right? There are big differences in those median pay levels. And in the last column there, we show what those gaps are. And as Craig just observed, they can be quite substantial. So this is showing that even after controlling and looking at a narrow group, right, where they're all in the same position, like for instance, registered nurses, okay, we're still getting a 7% pay difference there, right? So what's going on there? Where among registered nurses, we have the systematic difference. Craig,
Yes.
Do you want to add to that?
I would. So look at the first part, the left side, where it talks about what the wage gap translates into. And think about how that translates into wealth over time for the Black community, the Latina, the Latinx community, Native American community, Asian community. I actually think that there might be a typo on the percentage for Asian American Pacific Islanders, because it's the gap for Asian women is less than, as you can see, where it says 8401, which is a lower number. I think that's 82%, isn't it, Mark?
It could be a typo, but this I think my guess is that this might be referring to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. I think it might be a typo in the name as opposed.
That may be.
Yep.
But the point here is that, and these are all gaps compared to white men, and we already saw that for Asian men, they on average make even more than white men. And as I mentioned, some of the regulatory agencies like Osccp are now focusing more on Asian men as the comparator. So these percentages are actually even larger and inherently troubling. So, when you look at these different controlling for different occupations, because someone might say, oh, well, maybe if you control for occupations, this percentage will go down. And it does go down a bit, but it's still quite large. And just so everyone understands, when you're controlling for occupation, you're comparing an average white male in that occupation, white non-Hispanic male makes in that occupation compared to a Black woman, for example. And we know that the pay gap for Hispanic women is even a little larger. So it's critical. The reason I'm spending some time on this is that companies need to focus on intersectional pay gaps, or else what will happen, one, because you want your as a best practice, you want your even though Osccp is saying, well, look at race and gender, they published guidance when I was director saying, well, we're going to look at the intersection. This administration, the Biden administration, has focused on intersectionality as a primary focus. So I have a feeling they're going to continue to look at those pay gaps. So you should be doing it in advance proactively, both to do the right thing and address those pay gaps and also to limit your liability. But this is an area where there's likely to be pay gaps and pay disparities if the agency comes in and looks at your workforce. So that's why you really do need to be proactive. Next slide.
So with that review and just sort of highlight of pay gaps and the different dimensionality and the intersectionality of it, we're now going to move on to an overview of what has been the legislative and regulatory response. So starting with what has been going on at the state level, we just want to touch on some of the different dimensions of state legislative responses. So a first one is broadening the notion of comparability. So who can be compared? What does like to like mean when we're talking about are people doing equal pay for equal work? So several states have expanded that to a concept of substantially similar work or comparable work, as opposed to looking at individuals, men versus women, or people of different color versus whites or Asians or whatever. Instead of looking at that in terms of having to be with the same job title in the same position and doing exactly the same thing, states have been weakening that to a notion of substantially similar comparable work. Number two, states have been strengthening the requirement of what constitutes a bona fide explanation of a pay difference. So it can't be just under the federal legislation that we'll get to reviewing in just a moment from the 1960s. All that was required was that it was any factor other than sex. Well, many states have been saying, well, let's firm that up and make sure that this is a legitimate business justification for that pay difference. So that's what we mean by limiting the affirmative defense against pay discrimination. It's raising the threshold that an employer needs to show for a factor that explains a pay difference to be legitimate and to be considered admissible in that sense. Okay, the third point is the notion of prohibiting imposing salary history bans. So this prohibits employers from asking whether candidates and applicants asking what their salary was. So it, in theory at least, would prohibit an employer from building in a wage difference that employees brought with them from a prior position. So if an employer, like a woman or a woman of color, was paid less than her equivalent in that organization, in a male, let's say, this is meant to break that cycle, so that when that person moves to a new company, they don't have to bring that pay differential with them. So that's what the notion of the salary history band is. And it's been taken up by 20 states and also by 20 localities, cities. Okay, the next item on the list are equal pay safe harbors. So it's not all sticks. Some states have been offering carrots and incentives for companies to address, to examine equal pay and to make progress on addressing pay disparities. So that's an important component of state legislation as well. Another point here is pay transparency protection. So this is really protecting employees so that there's no retribution against them for discussing or sharing their compensation with each other. So again, this is trying to facilitate conversation, facilitate comparisons, so employees are empowered to ask, why am I being paid less than so-and-so, or why is that other person being paid less than I am, and so on. To be able to make those and get those kind of justifications out in front and made explicit by an employer. Okay, and then finally, the ones that we'll be spending a considerable amount of time on today is requirements of pay data reporting. And there are 3 states here which, to varying degrees, are requiring now that employers report their pay to the state agency.
Yes, and can you go back to the prior slide? The couple points to make here. One, expanding the definition of substantially similar comparable work, that's happening at the federal level too, at least not maybe through regulation, but through guidance. Osccp, for example, has slowly moved toward looking at comparable work, both in a compensation directive issued by Director Hsu, and also to some extent by one when I was director. So, and the thinking is of Osccp is when you're looking at systemic discrimination or systemic issues, you want to be able to get larger groups of employees into larger pay analysis groups, and you want to control for factors that could legitimately affect their pay, but that allows you to have more statistical power. Now, looking at that from an employer standpoint, though, an employer would likely come forward and say, well, look, but Title VII says similarly situated employees. That's not the same as comparable employees. That's why you see some of the states, and that was often a defense I would see raised at Ofccp, literally in every audit, that the pay analysis groups were grouping employees that were not similarly situated, and that it's not enough just to use statistical controls. And that was always a debate in every audit. That's why you see some states trying to address that through regulation or statute, and moving what the comparison is to substantially similar or comparable. Remember, 1963, you had the Equal Pay Act. Equal Pay Act, it basically had to be the identical job. Then you had Title VII, 1964, EO 11246, 1965. That was similarly situated employees. And since 65, you've seen this movement toward comparable. So that's something that's why when you're doing a pay equity self-audit, or you have an Ofccp audit, it's so critical to talk to counsel or to consultants, because these issues are potential pitfalls. And the agency may come to you and say, look, we grouped your entire exempt workforce together. And these could be completely different jobs. They're probably not even comparable. And yet the agency will say, but through the use of statistical controls, we can do this. And you may see states try to move in that direction as well. That's why it's important to raise defenses. I want to say two more things about this slide. Salary history bands. At this point, companies really should not, even if you're not in one of these states. And by the way, there's a lot of them now. You should not be looking at prior pay and setting current pay. That is a formula, frankly, for disaster. You will have pay gaps because you already see that there are pay gaps that exist. If you embed those from the moment someone starts at your company, you're going to have women making less than men. And as you know, most companies do pay gaps by giving raises every year based on a percentage. So if that man and that woman are both getting a 2% raise every year, but the man started a higher salary, 2% of a higher salary is a higher raise. So there's going to be an increasing gap between the two. So just one practice point. if you use prior pay, one, you may be doing something illegal, so take a look at that. But two, even if you're not, stop using prior pay to set pay. And then lastly, I'm a big supporter of equal pay safe harbors. You know, there's a debate, obviously, in this community over those. I supported them, and the reason why is because it's so uncertain, this area. So Ofccp may come in and form a pay analysis group of one set of employees. You may, in doing your proactive self-audit, do another set of employees. And you may make adjustments that actually increase the disparity when Ofccp comes in and groups those employees differently. So to me, I think the safe harbor concept is critical. And I did try to put that into directives and approaches when I was at Ofccp, because the agency should want, and the same with the EOC, should want companies doing this on a yearly basis, doing proactive self-audit, making adjustments. That helps employees. And if it's uncertain whether if you do that, that you might actually increase your liability, although you probably won't, I want to be clear, it'll probably help you to do that every year, but there's more uncertainty, and you would get more companies doing these proactive self-audits if there was a safe harbor of some sort. So that's why I'm generally in favor of them, because companies are trying to do the right thing. Next slide.
Wonderful. Okay, so this is something that Trusaic has put together, and I would note the source at the bottom here, Trusaic's Pay Equity Definitive Guide, which takes a state-by-state, conducts a state-by-state review of pay equity laws, laws related to pay, and then helps to also prioritize states in terms of where enforcement and where the legislation is strong and where it's weaker. So this combines several of those elements. It combines where pay transparency laws are effective, where pay reporting requirements are on the books, and so on. To give a sort of a view here, you can see the Northeast and the West Coasts are traditionally relatively strong in terms of pay equity legislation. Illinois has come to the forefront with its pay data reporting and certification requirements that we'll be talking about. So just want to make sure that the participants are aware of this as a resource for helping to navigate all of these different states and how they're evolving in terms of pay equity legislation. There is a guide, and Trusaic has put that together for you.
It's a very useful guide. One thing I'll tell you is if you look at this map and you look at it in 10 years, probably almost every single state will be orange or blue. So it's only moving toward more and more pay data reporting. And you know, one concern for employers is that they're probably not all going to be the same, even though many large corporations operate in every state, or at least in most states. So that one thing that's very interesting to think about is you have Director Jenny Yang, who really spearheaded pay data collection when she was at EEOC. And in fact, you know, changed a notice that I issued saying that Osccp wasn't going to look at the pay data reporting collected by EEOC because I was concerned that it wouldn't be a great use of resources for the agency, because the gaps that were being identified, we actually get, you know, in my opinion, we got better information when I was director. I'm sure it's still the same through our audits, where we could actually look at pay disparities. And in my view, looking at pay disparities is better, but you know, it's a legitimate disagreement. Reasonable minds can disagree. But I will tell you, as more states adopt pay data reporting, you may see companies really want Ofccp to adopt a uniform, at least for federal contractors, a more uniform pay data collection reporting, so as not to have to comply with many different states' different laws. And maybe that's true with the EOC too, because of the compliance costs. It's not that companies don't want to provide this information. You know, I mean, companies do like to, you know, care about competitive advantage and probably would prefer not to have to provide this information. Certainly if it were to be made public, they wouldn't want that. But, you know, at the same time, the major issue here, at least that I hear from companies, is the concern about multiple requirements that just pose a real burden in terms of compliance. I do expect, though, and Mark, I'm curious for your thoughts, I do expect to see from OFCCP in this administration a paid data collection at some point, either through the EOC for all companies or just one done by OFCCP for federal contractors, just based on the policy views of Director Yang.
I think that's probably a good call, Craig. Yeah, I would tend to agree. We see that as a direction. And as you said, this heat map is just getting hotter at the state level, and it's also been having an influence on the federal level as well. So I would agree with that. That one way or another, OFCCP is going to be looking at pay data broadly, not just in terms of specific reviews, but taking a more stand back 360-degree view of federal contractors. Great. Next slide, please. I think we don't have to spend too much time on this slide because Craig has already hit these high points, which is looking at it from a federal perspective, and he's already touched on some of the history here, going back to the Federal Equal Pay Act in 1963, the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that followed that, and then the OFCCP's Executive Order 11246. So all of these steps at strengthening protections for protections against pay discrimination at the federal level. And then where we might focus for a few minutes is on this issue of federal pay data reporting, because we did have it for 2 years, right? we had it, I think it was it was authorized under the Obama administration that the EEOC would start to collect aggregated pay data from companies which of 100 employees or more, those who had historically been reporting their diversity, their demographic information by job category. The EEOC was requiring them to then also provide compensation and hours data for, again, in aggregated form for those same employers. And there was a move that put a stop to that under the previous administration, and then there was litigation brought by the National Women's Law Center and the Labor Council of Latin America for Latin American Advancement that overturned that stop, and so that that pay data collection went ahead, and it was collected for the reporting years of 2017 and 2018. So as Craig just alluded to, there's that data, that process is under review right now with the National Academy of Sciences Committee, which I think is probably the third review that this process has had. It had a couple of reviews before it was even implemented, and I think that the expectation is that that's EEOC component to pay data reporting is going to come back. So I would agree with Craig with that there. So we saw that there's this increasing pressure at the state level, but we also see that there's an increasing, there's most likely going to be increasing compliance and reporting costs on employers at the federal level as well.
And one thing I'd like to add, and it's not listed here because it obviously doesn't rise to the level of Title VII or the executive order, but there was a directive that I issued when I was director. That's the OFCCP compensation directive. It's still the active way that OFCCP looks at pay. And it is done in a way that respects employers' ability to choose the factors that they use to set pay. So take a look at that directive. It's on OFCCP's website. It was largely designed, I mean, I set policy goals, but it was largely put together by career staff at OFCCP. And it was intended to explain the way that the agency looks at compensation and pay disparities. And it's something that actually can be used by companies that are not even federal contractors. It's because there's a lot of best practices there as well. The practice point, though, that I want to raise here, considering that pay data collection is going to become the norm, and probably in almost every jurisdiction. And I agree with Mark, likely EEOC and OFCCP. You got to be proactive and be preemptive. And what I would do is I would look at that directive and put together the factors that you as a company use to set pay and have those written down. Use those factors, centralize your pay processes to the extent possible to avoid disparities that will occur that you are going to have to report to the embarrassment of your company. If you have disparities or gaps that you have to report, considering that DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, is the norm and is what's expected of companies in today's America. And companies are stepping up to do that. But you can have all the great policies you want, but if you have a large pay gap and you have to report it and it gets published through a FOIA request or something like that, it's going to be embarrassing for your company. And you're going to have internal stakeholders who are going to be upset. And you need to address those things in advance.
Great point, Craig. Okay, and just some additional. This is just offering some additional support to Craig's observation as to which way the federal winds are blowing and where we're headed. These are other indicators that pay and DEI are high priorities under the current administration. So, for instance, one of President Biden's top initiatives is making pay equity a top priority and reinforcing that with both through the Ofccp and the EEOC. In March on International Women's Day, the White House set up a gender policy council for advising on pay and other issues related to gender differences. Then Executive Order 13985, advancing racial equity and support for undeserved communities through the federal government, was signed on day one of the new administration. The administration has promised additional funding for the EEOC, the Osccp, and the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. The Paycheck Fairness Act has been taken up again, and it's not passed the Senate again, but it does not go away. There's still pressure within Congress for this revision and expansion of equal pay legislation at the federal level. Then other regulatory agencies, the FDIC is seeking voluntary diversity, equity, and inclusion self-assessments from financial institutions. There was a reversal regarding ERISA, regarding retirement plans, that they should be considering ESG priorities, including representation and equal pay. NASDAQ has proposed new listing rules to require public disclosure of diversity of boards of directors, expressly including LGBTQ plus individuals in boards. And the SEC has issued an alert indicating more rigorous coming for ESG investing. So we've got a whole, a lot of different dimensions here, but from investment, from stock markets, from retirement accounts, and with respect to Congress and the White House, they're all sort of pushing the same direction, which is respecting and enforcing greater scrutiny of diversity, equity, and inclusion, including pay equity.
And then I would like to just focus on the Paycheck Fairness Act for a moment and give you sort of an insider's perspective from when I was at DOL, obviously in a Republican administration. The Paycheck Fairness Act is unlikely to get adopted in the Senate because typically Republicans and perhaps more moderate Democrats are often concerned about the regulatory burdens that come about with statutes like that. And because of the filibuster in the Senate and the structure of the Senate, it's probably unlikely to be passed. Nevertheless, based on my insights that I've gotten from being director, I would take a close look at that act and maybe proactively adopt some of those steps, because the agency, Ofccp, for example, and likely the EEOC, may seek through guidance and even regulatory action to do a lot of things in the Paycheck Fairness Act. So, and that's likely how you're going to see it adopted to the extent it is, through regulatory action, through guidance published by Osccp. And, the agency hasn't published guidance yet in the compensation area. I would expect them to at some point. It's likely to be very similar to the Paycheck Fairness Act. So that's why you do need to be aware of these things, even if they're unlikely to pass.
An example of that, Craig, is that the Paycheck Fairness Act includes EEOC collecting pay data, right? Which they've already started to do. So, great points. Okay, then just one more layer to the federal dimension here is this potential synergy between the Ofccp and the EEOC, or another connection between them. In this recent announcement by the Ofccp that the agency says it will use component 2 pay data to assess its utility for identifying pay inequity and strengthen efforts to combat pay discrimination. So this is sort of looking at some of the implications of that. EEO1 component 2 pay data reporting may play a role in helping to guide the Ofccp in their enforcement efforts. It's also, again, fitting with these other pieces. So right now, this reporting requirement for pay to the EEOC is on hold. It's being reviewed. But the fact that the Ofccp has come out and said, we would like to look at this data, we'd like to examine it, offers support to it returning. So that's another indication that federal pay reporting requirements are probably likely to come back. It's also in alignment with what California is doing, because California's obviously got a pay data reporting requirement. But there are other sides of that, and maybe I'll let Craig turn to those.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate, and I touched on it before about the use of component 2 data by Ofccp. I think there was a thought that the agency might focus its scheduling on companies with larger pay gaps. The concern I had when I was director and I looked at the data, one, obviously there was a lot of litigation over the data, and it didn't look like it was going to continue year to year. So it's very hard to adopt a new scheduling process based on data you're only going to receive once, and also data that may be several years old. I mean, this is 2018 data. Two, one of the concerns about component 2 pay data collection was that it used W2 pay data in large EEO1 categories, and that might not be specific enough to really derive a conclusion about a company, that you could have gaps there, and yet if you drill down, not have pay disparities. And so it might give the false impression that a company was discriminating when they're not. And that was a concern that a lot of companies had. So, ultimately, Ofccp, when we receive data from federal contractors through our scheduling letter, we receive much more granular data, and can focus on actual pay disparities compared to while controlling for factors used to set pay. And we can also make sure to form pay analysis groups. I know there's some debate about whether the agency does this or not, but you can form pay analysis groups of similarly situated employees, as opposed to just using broad categories. So I think, what I would say now as sort of a commentator and someone who advises companies is the danger of the component 2 requirement is that it may give a false impression of companies, and that really what's important if they are going to do pay data collection is to look at more similarly situated employee groups and whether there are pay gaps there. So the other point I would raise is that it's a lot of use of resources. So EEOC, if you give this information to the EEOC, it's protected by law, by a criminal statute. It has to remain confidential. I think companies are okay with that. I'm not sure if they're okay with the Comp 2, but they're okay with the idea that it's going to be confidential. They support that. Ofccp, things are not kept confidential because of FOIA. Because Ofccp, that statute has been determined by the DC Circuit, the confidentiality statute, not to apply to Ofccp. So anything Ofccp receives is subject to FOIA. And this is where companies get very concerned. So if they're going to end up giving more significant data to Ofccp, and not in an enforcement action, but through a data collection that's general, there's a concern that they're going to get a FOIA request for every federal contractor's pay gaps or pay information, and that then we'll have to go through alerting companies under the exemption 4 process. This is not a FOIA lecture, so I won't get into it, But there's sort of an elaborate process to notify companies about the request for their information, to adjudicate internally whether you're going to assert an objection or an exemption. That takes a tremendous amount of resources. And I can tell you that as a former director, FOIA was a huge part of what we did. And the amount of time, and I support FOIA, but the point being that the time we spent on that was to the detriment of our other areas that we would focus on, like pay equity, hiring equity, promotion equity. And instead we had to devote a lot of resources to FOIA. So this is likely to lead to even more resources being devoted to FOIA. And that's why I don't think in the end it's necessarily going to be supportive of pay equity. I think what would be better would be for Ofccp to get more funding, get more compliance officers, and do more audits. And make sure that in doing those audits that they're following the guidance that they published, that I did when I was director, that respects companies and the way that they set their pay systems. And then make those audits quick. Go in there, take a look, and if there's not an issue, move on. Don't leave a company in an audit for 2 years and then close the audit. Anyway, I'm going on a little bit here, but you can see, I think that all of these pieces come together, and I'm concerned that this is going to take a lot of resources from the agency without much benefit.
Thank you. And maybe this I think ties into some of Craig's concerns here. So this is meant to just sort of highlight some directions in which the Ofccp may use these data. Any direction, though, as Craig observed, is going to require resources to be effective. So under the first bullet point here, we have the potential that the Ofccp will assess complaints and measured compliance violations relative to this new data set, because it is a new data set. And so they can use that as a way of checking complaints to see whether they also align with evidence from these new pay data that also it points in the same direction, or does it point in an opposite direction? And what is the hit rate? What is the success with looking at that relationship? Does it seem like these new data are to help predict or are supportive of cases where complaints have merit, as opposed to cases where they don't have merit? Right? When compliance violations are identified, when are those more than just a box ticking exercise, or when do they show a real lapse in concern for pay and equity? So that's one potential, is to use it as corroborating indicators, and to see to what extent those corroborating indicators are effective in ultimately helping to focus resources. And similarly, number two is looking even more broadly at industries, geographies, firm structures, job categories, contracting agencies, and so on, because this is a universe of data that the EEOC would be collecting, right? It's not it goes beyond federal contractors, obviously, but also includes them and spans all these and other dimensions. And so, from that perspective, both the EEOC and the Ofccp may be looking to see what stands out, and whether that is cause for concern. Are there particular contracting agencies that seem to have issues? Are there particular industries that seem to have issues relative to others? And what might those be? And looking at the intersection of these factors. And then finally, ultimately, both of these dimensions feed into the last dimension, which Craig has also alluded to, is will these data help improve efficiency? Will they help make enforcement resources go further and be more effective? And that's really the ultimate test. And that may come down, as Craig observed, you can't construct scheduling criteria over old data or over a one-time collection of data. It's got to be something that's ongoing. So if component 2 data comes back and it is ongoing and it has some sustainability to it, does it add value, right? And if it does, then we could see that some of the learnings from those data could help to inform scheduling decisions, or may.
I'd say that I agree with what Mark said. I'd say that can you go back? I'd say that the two most likely areas where Ofccp will use it will be to use it to do a study on which industries have the largest pay gaps, and then also scheduling. Maybe at some point saying that if a company has a gap or an average gap that's larger than X, they're more likely to be scheduled for a review. The point, though, is that, you know, when we were deciding how to use this data, you know, the general view, I mean, there was some debate and discussion, of course, and, you know, I always, when I was director, would have meetings with all the career staff, the career leadership, and we discussed these issues. And I'd say the general view of career leadership was that this information would not be so useful and that the costs outweighed the benefits. Now, obviously, there's a new leader and there's a different approach, but that's the way that we would have used it if we had if we had gotten the data for studies. And that's the way, you know, I was looking at what is the benefit of maybe doing a study and then using it for scheduling. But I think the danger, and I'll raise this issue again, is that if you're relying on these gaps in these large categories, and you're not really looking at, well, what factors does a company use to set pay? And you're only looking at W-2 data, and you're not looking at more granular data, where you can compare employees more easily, including total compensation data, for example, or other forms of data, or plain-based compensation, whatever it may be. That's not what W-2 is. So the concern is that it may not be so useful, and that it may be that when Ofccp publishes a scheduling list in the future, that the companies on the list will have to defend themselves right away because, oh, you've been picked because apparently based on Comp2 data, you're more likely to be a violator. But one thing that you'll see is that over the course of Osccp's history, in Republican and Democratic administrations, the agency typically finds a violation in 2 to 5% of its reviews. And I think the thinking is that this will not necessarily increase that percentage. Nevertheless, you know, open mind and reasonable minds can disagree on this. But I think that's how the agency will use it for scheduling.
Hi, this is Angel. I just wanted to jump in. I just wanted to give a time check. We do have about 25 minutes left, and we do have some questions coming in. So just wanted you to be aware.
Thank you, Angel. Yeah, so maybe yeah. In the interest of time, maybe we have to.
Why don't you go through the state slides quickly, and make your points. I'll save my comments till the end of all the state slides, and I'll give you some thoughts on state, because my focus is obviously more federal, based on my experience. Although I do practice in the state area, but you're working on this every day, so why don't you talk about it?
Okay, thanks, Craig. Yeah, maybe just in terms of time. Just what we're going to do right now is focus on 2 states, California, that have pay data reporting requirements. I'll just note that New Jersey was the first to require state contractors to report pay data, so they're even ahead of California. But California and Illinois are 2 states that are requiring, broadly speaking, most employers with at least 100 employees to file. In California, just some highlights here. Who has to file? If essentially if you have to file with the EEOC, you need to file with California if you have at least 1 California employee. Okay, so it's a very broad net, and you don't need to have a very large California presence to be considered here. With that, we should move on to the next slide. Realize that it's a broad field here. As I alluded to a moment ago, it's closely modeled on the EEOC's pay data reporting component 2, requires gender, race, ethnicity, pay, and hours worked across those 10 EEOC job categories. Let's see, how are employers affected? Employers with employees in California have a significant compliance obligation, obviously, to report these data. And we'll talk in a moment about what the enforcement is, but the key point here is that this just came into effect. It came into effect this past March, and it was extended at least once later in the spring. But the first enforcement, we know now as of last week what the first enforcement step is, because the DFEH has just issued thousands of letters to for non-filers. Okay, so their first step in enforcement is to make sure that employers are following this law and filing. So it's not something that you can fly under the radar on. And why is that? It's because they have access to the California Employment Development Department's database, which is about employment and about unemployment insurance. So they know employers' payrolls, they know what their workforce sizes are, and they know who is in theory supposed to be filing here. And so they're sending out those notices, and we just saw some this morning to enforce that compliance. We were able to help several companies with this, with a spring filing, and that brings us to our next slide. So we helped a lot of companies with these filings, and as part of that assistance, we also gave them a heads up as to what that data showed for that individual employer. Okay, what kind of race and gender pay gaps would be evident to the regulatory agency, which is called the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, DFEH, in California. And what we did here was we aggregated the data. What we did was we did pay differences. We measured pay differences controlling for EEO1 job category, controlling for industry, and controlling for location. And then we looked and measured a gender pay gap between males and non-males. California recognizes a third non-binary gender, and then between white and non-white workers in the state. So we took these two different perspectives on it, didn't really examine intersectionality. But from those two different perspectives, these are the numbers we got on a statewide basis. And again, these are extrapolated from our sample of clients that we assisted to the state, using that same data, the EDD data, the Employment Development Department, California Employment Development Department data on the total sizes of these workforces in different industries, and then came up with these results. So the headline numbers here are big, okay? And so this is what these numbers similar to these are what's sitting in the DFEH's data set right now, okay, in the California regulators data set right now. They're seeing enormous gender and race ethnicity pay gaps in the data that they've collected. Now, is that where they're going to stop with this? Probably not. And that brings us to our next slide, which is making the same kind of comparisons that we were talking about, or hypothesizing, speculating to some extent that the Ofccp might be making and the EEOC would be making at the federal level if federal pay data came back. That's here now in California, okay? The Department of Fair Employment and Housing can look at this from an industry perspective and say, okay, which industry has the highest pay gaps, which industries have the lowest pay gaps, which industries have the highest gender pay gaps, which industries have the highest race ethnicity pay gaps. They can look at that from a variety of perspectives. We just did this to illustrate that these are the kinds of comparisons in the aggregate that DFEH is going to be able to make with the data they already have in hand, and they're enforcing to collect even more of this. So you can see here that what we found was that the professional, scientific, and technical services and manufacturing had the highest pay gaps across the industries that we measured. If we go to the next slide, we'll just illustrate that we can look at this from a variety of different perspectives, and given the larger data set that the DFEH has collected, they can look at it at intersections. Okay. But for instance, so here we're looking at it from a job category perspective. Okay, so the job category, and this goes back to one of Craig's early points, is that where do we see the biggest pay gaps? Well, we see them in the higher compensated individuals. In those groups is where we see the largest pay differences. And so we're seeing that here in terms of executives, both for gender and race ethnicity, and then for officials and managers, we're seeing that as a secondary group in terms of race ethnicity. We're also, but it's not limited to just those groups, right? We also found that technicians are showing a substantial pay gap as well. So it need not necessarily always be, although they are reflected here, the highest paid groups. But
let me make one point. One point here, if I can come in. Take a look at how large that pay gap is. We'll use the gender one, 11,200 per employee for executives. Let's say you have 100 executives. You're a big company. Let's say you have 100 executives. That's the average pay gap. You're talking right there about $1 million, a little over $1 million. Now, Osccp typically looks back 2 years. So there you got $2 million. Under Lilly Ledbetter, if the agency ends up suing a company, they'll go back 7, 8 years, because of the continued pay gap. That's how you can get to claims. And sometimes when I was at the agency, the pay disparities would be extremely large, tens of millions, hundreds of millions even, if you're not controlling for factors. And in Republican administrations tend to focus more on factors that are controlled for. Democratic administrations, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but tend to focus more on exogenous factors, just a few factors that are not controlled by the company. That's a difference. When you're only looking at education and tenure, and that's all you're controlling for, you could have really large pay gaps. The point I'm trying to make, in really quick, is that there's huge potential liability here for companies, depending on how it's approached. And that's why it's critical you talk to counsel or a consultant about this and do annual pay equity audits, because of that number. You're talking about a lot of potential liability.
Super point. Thanks, Craig. All right, so let's move on to that next slide in the interest of time. So this is just summarizing some points here. We made those pay gap comparisons based on controlling for industry, job category, location. As Craig has noted, under Democratic administrations, which we have here in California currently, there may tend to be fewer factors controlled for, that not many more added to this versus Republican controlled administrations that may be a concern too. So that may elevate risks, current risks, to having unexamined pay gaps, where the employer has submitted these data, hasn't really looked at what they imply, and hasn't taken a proactive look at their pay to be able to defend themselves should they be an outlier in this data collection, or be in one of the groups that are getting greater scrutiny. Okay, next slide, please. So with that, with those pay data reporting requirements that are active right now and that are being enforced in California, I just wanted to turn to Illinois for a few slides, because the situation is even more stringent there. So as we can see, what are the three key components of the Illinois pay legislation? First, companies need to certify that they're paying equally. Okay, and that is effectively the certifying to the state that you have actually performed an equal pay audit and that you have rectified any problems that you found. In addition to that, the state is collecting your EEO-1 Component 1 reports for Illinois employees, and they're publishing them. Okay, so they're making them public. So your diversity information by job category and by location will be published by the state of Illinois. The third factor on here, not directly related to pay though, or at least gender and race pay issues, is that they're protecting discrimination based on conviction records. I would say there's one more element that I want to bring up here, which is that in addition to having your demographic data, Component 1, published by the state of Illinois, employers who are covered by these laws are also providing their wage data to the state. And it's at a more disaggregated level than that. That's either under EEOC or under the California pay data reporting requirement. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so who's affected? Here, there's a bit of a narrowing relative to California. You have to have at least 100 employees within the state boundaries. It's not clear how that's particularly defined with respect to telework or remote telecommuting. But employers have to get the certification, and they have to renew the certification every 2 years. Next slide, please. Okay, so here, the certification consists of an equal pay compliance statement, and that's the statement that is spelling out that a company has no pay inequities, and that has addressed any pay inequities that it may have. And you can see in number 4, they have to submit a comprehensive list of all employees employed during the calendar year, separated by gender, race, ethnicity, and given their wages as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So this is a lot more detail here, But in effect, what has to be attested for in the compliance statement is the kind of pay equity, proactive pay equity audit that I was just referring to. So the certification has to say that female and minority employees are not paid consistently below the average compensation of male non-minority employees within each major job category, taking into account additional factors. Okay, so they do give you that leeway, that latitude, that justified business factors can be used to explain pay differences. But that in effect is a pay equity audit, you bringing in those additional factors. So they're giving you that opportunity, but you need to certify that you've actually conducted that analysis. Okay, next slide, please. This is again, we're saying that that the legislation goes beyond just pay and also deals with it's a sort of a ban the box kind of initiative where you're not allowed to ask about prior criminal records except in certain limited situations for employment. Okay. So try to get through that quickly. Craig, did you want to add any more comments to California or Illinois?
No, I just want to, there's going to be more states doing that. The Illinois one in particular, companies need to start focusing on now, because you got some time to get ready to do that certification, but you're going to have to do it. And I'm telling you, it's potentially quite concerning to whoever has to make that certification in your company. And it's good to bring in someone now. And I would recommend someone from outside your company to come in, take a look at these factors, address the issues, because sometimes you can't just address them in a month. Sometimes it takes a year or two. And so start addressing them now and have them tell you, yes, you can certify. That protects you. That's the main point I would raise. Great.
Thanks, Craig. So now, why don't we turn for a few minutes to pay equity audits as a proactive pay equity audits as the solution, as the tool that you really need, that employers really need to invest in, given all these pressures, and particularly if you're operating in California or Illinois, it's pretty much essential to have conducted a proactive pay equity audit. There are 9 elements that we wanted to highlight here with respect to pay equity audits. We won't be able to go into these in very much detail, but it's important for employers, I think, to be aware of these different dimensions. So we've touched on some of them already. Ensuring data integrity. With every client that we've worked with, getting the data together, making sure the data is clean, making sure that it's consistent is the big piece. That's a big deal, and that's true for the work that we've done at Trusaic, and it's also true when we've heard of companies who've done their own pay equity audits. That getting the data right, because it's the data, getting it initially set up is resource intensive, and it's really helpful to have someone as a partner that can help you with that data integration step. The second component that Craig has also referred to, the notion of pay analysis groups. Is your whole workforce going to be analyzed in one pay analysis, one statistical model, or is it going to be broken up? And if it's going to be broken up, what's the justification for that? Okay, because nothing is taken for granted by a regulator or a litigant, if it should come to that, in terms of how the data has been divided up. And so employers need and should invest in empirical support for the reasons that they've cut up the data to analyze it appropriately into separate groups that have separate factors driving their pay determinants, separate sets of pay determinants. So the next piece is measuring legitimate pay differences. That's ensuring or testing really that the factors that you think are driving pay, are they actually driving pay? Is there a gap between practice and pay philosophy? That can be identified. Is there a gap between what you think is driving pay and what's statistically significant in explaining pay differences? Okay, so a pay equity audit will reveal those issues to you. And at the same time, when you find that there are big drivers of legitimate drivers of pay differences, that opens up scope for considering whether there are the extent to which those factors are justified by business necessity. The fourth element is quantifying risk. So what's left over, what pay disparities are found, if any, and what is the annual cost of those. Number 5 is validating findings. Okay, so a pay equity audit is not just running a regression. There are a multitude of statistical and other types of checks on the analyses to assess whether the findings are reliable or not. And it's important that you have a partner or invest in those additional checks to make sure you're not running off in a direction that's just a statistical fluke. Investigating in root causes. If a pay disparity is found, gender or race pay disparity or the combination of the two, can it be isolated? Is it broad-based across all of the employees that you're looking at, or is it within a pay group, or is there a focused subset that seems to be driving the result? What are the characteristics of that result? Developing remediation strategies. How do you want to approach remediation? Do you want to focus on the class disparity that's measured? Do you want to focus on individual differences and try to get pay more normalized so that it's less variable? Those are different strategies, and they're different, and they have different implications. Knowing and what are the costs of those, and being able to target those in different subsets of the organization to prioritize. Number 8, monitoring progress. Okay, is very important. Once pay disparities are found, once mitigation or remediation steps are taken, have they been successful? How has the workforce changed, and what impact do those changes in terms of turnover have on remaining pay disparities? And over all of these is the issue of maintaining legal privilege. That a proactive pay equity audit is meant to inform the employer and to give them the resources they need to make informed decisions and to pursue effective strategies without having to divulge this information to a regulator.
Yes, I would add also that for federal contractors, you have a legal obligation every year under 41 CFR 60-2.17B to be assessing your compensation. There's also an FAQ from Ofccp on this. It's compensation FAQ number 5. I have a feeling the agency may publish even more on this in this administration. So it looks like there may be a lot here, a lot of steps, but the first step is to actually do one. Hire. And the privilege is extraordinarily important, particularly if it's your first time, because you may identify some disparities. You don't want that to be an admission. You want to have a space where you can address those without having to be overly concerned about liability. So you can try to do the right thing and not only be considering risk management. It's extraordinarily important to hire counsel, have counsel bring in the pay equity auditor under privilege. I know there's some debate with the agency. It was my position as director, and I think it's crystal clear that if a company hires a lawyer, I mean, you have a duty every year to do a basic compensation review, and you should do that, and you should do one that you're prepared to produce to the agency to show you've done it. But then if you're going to do a more extensive one with the advice of counsel telling you how to look at it, that should 100% be set up under privilege. You should defend that privilege. Your counsel should defend that privilege to the agency. And you should then do, at least a basic pay equity audit, at least look at cohorts, compare people, do t-tests. But if you can, the best practice is to do regression and really evaluate your entire pay processes every year. And if you do that every year, it's going to help you. Ofccp, it's required to do something every year. But I would tell you, my advice, my guidance, every company should be doing this every year, at least if it's of a certain size. So to look at these systemic issues. And for very small companies, they should at least be looking at it in a cohort analysis where you're comparing male employees and female employees and making sure there's not a gap if they have similar credentials, for example, or similar tenure. By the way, I know we have 5 questions. We're going to answer them, so don't worry. We're going to get to those.
Well, if we cannot answer them, I just want to say, this is Angel. We will follow up with our email with the certificates and answers to all the questions that came in. So I don't want to harbor the discussion because we do have many slides left, but we're happy to provide the answers to the questions in an email follow-up.
Okay, great. Angel, maybe to split the difference here, why don't we just skip to slide 45 because
Okay.
the subsequent slides were really drilling in on these 9 elements. But in the interest of time, we'll probably just get to the summary here.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
That's the
Yeah,
one
and
with
even though,
the triangle.
take a look at these slides carefully if you're doing it yourself, but I highly recommend bringing in someone to do it. It's always going to be viewed that if you do it yourself, it doesn't receive the same deference, frankly, than bringing in someone that comes in and tells you what they found. It protects you more, particularly for these certifications, to have a third party come in.
Thanks, Craig. That is a very helpful and worthwhile insight. And this slide is really focusing on that same issue about why partnerships, why the outside partnership is so helpful. We've touched on some of these. Craig is hitting another one that I also want to come back to, which is the notion of integrity or defensibility, because but just to frame this starting up, we look at this as having this sort of triangle of trust. We talked about how resource intensive the data issue is, about getting the data right. Important to have the right analytics and have them flow throughout the process, and then also be sensitive to and aware of and reflecting regulatory differences until we get to that point where we have some sort of umbrella federal legislation that supersedes all the state differences. There are state differences, and it's important for us to, and international differences that we haven't even started to talk about, that need to be accounted for. But back to the point about the perception of a pay equity audit that's done under the auspices of an outside partner. There's a tendency, a natural tendency for internal exercises to devolve to some extent into a vanity metrics exercise. And by that I mean is that purely internal audits will, if they find disparities, okay, will often run into some resistance, and that and can be readily redirected. So an internal audit finds some disparities, and then that there's some pushback against those findings, and so they're sent back to review, to revisit those findings and to re-examine them. Such pressures can result in really a degradation of the analysis, and it's no one's intention. It's just that those are the kinds of internal dynamics that we've seen. And to give a specific example, there was pushback against some internal results, and a company realized they didn't have performance the right kind of performance, proficiency measures, and so instead of they just don't have them, and they don't have those proficiency measures. So instead, what they opted to do was to look at where people were in their pay ranges and say, if they're low in their pay range, they must be low proficiency, and if they're high in their pay range, they must be high proficiency. So they constructed this proficiency measure, but it's completely and it explains pay differences, but it's not an explanation. It's just saying that people are either in low, middle, or high pay points. So anyway, that's not going to carry a lot of muster with the regulator either. Anyway, maybe now I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Mark and Craig. This was such a wealth of information, and probably we should have had a few hours dedicated to it. So I appreciate your time and all of your information. So before we all leave, I just do want to launch a quick poll. Obviously, this was amazing information and could be very helpful to all of our employers. So if you're interested in learning more about Circa or Trusaic or K&L Gates law firm services, I invite you to fill out this poll very quick, just yes or no. And we will be sending out a on-demand version of the presentation. And as promised, we will answer all the questions in that email follow-up as well. I thank you all for attending today. And we will have my information, Craig's information, and Mark's information in the video recording as well. So again, thank you so much for attending. And we made it to the time.
Super. Thanks for keeping us on track as best you could, Angel. It was a challenge.
Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks.